Hey everyone, this is Baylor. I am discussing the topic of censorship, and I want to give a little heads up at the beginning that because of the nature of the topic, I have to talk about some kind of graphic video and stuff that gets shared. I don't get into detail, and I think most people who listen to this would not be bothered by the mentions of it, but if that's something you don't want to hear, this might not be the video for you to watch. So, censorship. What is it? Well, broadly, censorship is restricting access to information. So, this can be anything from, killing bad news stories you don't like online to refusing to let a 12-year-old into an R-rated movie. And it's a pretty contentious issue, and I wanted to unpack why before we moved on. I think we associate censorship with authoritarianism and, like the USSR and crushing dissent and things like that. And that's one reason. But I also think it just feels bad. And the type of censorship I'm going to be talking about is online censorship. And I think you really can't discredit that in terms of people's reactions to how they feel when they've been censored online or when they feel they've been censored online. That feeling of being told your opinion isn't wanted, your opinion doesn't matter. That really hurts people sometimes. And I think that's why it's just such a really divisive issue. I'm going to be covering this topic from kind of the ground up, so you might hear some stuff that seems kind of obvious or that you've heard before, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page, so, just stick with me. Most people understand that we have this constitutional right to free speech, but that it does have its limits. So the classic example is that if you shout fire in a crowded theater, that doesn't protect, or the right to free speech doesn't protect that action. You still incited a panic and you're still responsible for that. And there's a few other examples of censorship that we generally think of as a social good that I want to bring up just to kind of take some of the mystique off of the word, to remove some of the stigma. So I think it's worth to mention forms of censorship like censoring content from children. So most people understand that you should not be taking your 3-year-old to see 50 Shades of Grey or Game of Thrones or whatever. And we generally understand that censoring this content from children is a good until they can understand it. Reporting guidelines for suicides. So this comes up in the news every once in a while. There are guidelines to prevent suicide as a social health issue. So when news reporters cover it, usually they'll try not to sensationalize elements of the death, like including the manner in which the person has killed themselves. They won't include notes from the suicide note. At least, responsible reporting will not include quotes from the suicide note. And that's to prevent a domino effect of suicide, which is, like I said, a public health issue. When someone's safety is at stake, I think that's usually a piece of censorship people understand. Like military secrets or, the witness protection program or something like that. We understand that that's something that doesn't necessarily need to be shared with everyone. And then morally objectionable content in general. And that's kind of the issue that we're talking about today. So I think most people would agree that morally objectionable content should be censored. We just kind of disagree on where that line is. I think people who are really, really hard line against censorship would agree that we shouldn't be censoring something like child pornography. Like that is obviously a huge evil thing to do, and it doesn't matter that the censorship is not the issue there. However, we still might not draw the line in the same place. So I'm really interested in the way this type of censorship intersects with political censorship and with free speech online. So we're going to be talking about online platforms, stuff like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, and their policies in terms of what they remove content, should they be allowed to remove content that they find objectionable. Also, we could sit here and go over the individual instances. I'd be happy to go over individual instances with you guys in the discussion room. But in this video, I'm just going to be kind of arguing about the practice on the whole. So, like I said, our platforms are going to be these kind of A1 large social media platforms, something where users submit content and how that content is moderated. Our expectations for these platforms is that these are accessible platforms, they're safe, and that they are useful or enjoyable. And we've kind of agreed that there's forms of censorship that's that's like reasonable or like a social good, even if we disagree on how to define them. But I think there's this expectation of fairness on the platforms as well in the way that rules are enforced, and we expect that fairness to look the way that fairness looks on the outside, right? So generally, we like to have the rules beforehand. That's your terms of service. We like to have some type of authority to enforce those rules consistently. That's like a moderator or moderation team, and that might be artificial intelligence, or that might be an actual person. And then we want an appeals process if we feel like we've been treated unfairly by that enforcement. And if you take a look at people who feel they've been unfairly censored, the complaints are usually against one of those three issues. They'll say, oh, well, the rules weren't laid out to me, or well, I did this, but this other person did this over here, or this happened, or this decision was incorrect and no one would talk to me about it. That's kind of where the expectation breaks down. I feel like that's where a lot of the anger comes. And so I also want to talk about what the platforms themselves expect. I said, well, we expect accessibility, safety, and usefulness. I think the platforms expect, the opportunity to be profitable, or to be profitable in the future. These are for-profit companies. But I think they also expect to be allowed an ideology. So we look at Google and we see this monolith, but somewhere within that structure is a human being making and reviewing decisions. And this may be naive. I welcome you guys calling me naive, but I think generally if a person has strong beliefs, they don't want to work at a place undermining them. That's not really how people who have the opportunity to decide, where to work. So this is also the point where I'm going to mention that legally, these platforms are not required to structure their moderation the way I described. If Mark Zuckerberg just started mass deleting comments because he just didn't like them, there is no requirement for him to have a stated list of rules or to enforce them consistently. That's totally legal as long as he doesn't ban content based on a user's membership in a protected class. I'm going to go over the protected classes in the United States. There's race, religion, national origin, age, sex, pregnancy, familial status, that's whether or not a person is a child, disability status, veteran status, and the most recent one, which is genetic information. And you'll notice that political affiliation or ideology are not included on that list. There were hearings in April on that topic specifically, whether or not online platforms can remove stuff for political reasons. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's going to change. There was a bill released just this week on the topic, but it doesn't really seem to have the support, and it's not expected to pass. If I had to speculate, I don't think that it will, just because it's coming from the conservative members of the Senate, and generally they like to not interfere with companies as much as possible. So I don't think that the legality of removing politically untenable content on a social media platform is going to change anytime soon. The prevailing legal precedent on this, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, lists reasons that I would say fall under the umbrella of morally objectionable. That's kind of what we were talking about earlier. The relevant text states that a provider is not liable for actions to restrict access to content, that's censorship, it deems, and this is a direct quote, obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected, end of quote. So clearly this definition gives a lot of power to the platforms to decide the type of content they'll allow. However, the law is not the final issue on an ethics question. And I think, we still have a room to debate the ethics of this decision, even if it's not strictly unlawful. So I think first we're going to talk about some common reasons for censorship on the platforms, and then we're going to compare them to our stated expectations as users of these services. So what type of censorship do we see on these platforms? Well, there's a few that I think, again, are mostly common sense, but it's still worth it to understand how broad the term censorship is. So stolen content is one. Obviously, Twitter does not have to assist you steal or distribute copyrighted content, and that includes original content of yours that contains copyrighted content. Twitter has the right, some might even say the responsibility to take that down. Other illegal content, so stories or media depicting abuse or describing abuse, coordination of illegal activity. And it's worth noting in this field that online platforms actually aren't liable for that illegal behavior from users, with the exception of human trafficking. They are liable for that. But most platforms will still make some effort to remove posts like this regardless. Graphic content, so pornography. Generally, a mainstream platform like YouTube or Twitter will have some rules regarding this. The history of people trying to place the line for what is and isn't pornography begins way before the internet. So definitions for things like nudity and sex acts vary from platform to platform. I'm going to keep it educational, but the legalese and these terms of service around these issues is super funny, and I really highly recommend reading them. Gore or otherwise violent content also falls under the umbrella of graphic. This is also hard to define, but usually a platform will have a policy on media depicting death or serious injury to people and animals. And this content might not be banned per se, but be restricted to users confirming their age or treated with an advance warning, like I did for this video. So then we move into kind of the more contentious issues and the more debatable issues. Encouraging and threatening violence is a big one. People usually agree that this is something that should be monitored, but there are frequent disagreements on what is and isn't encouraging violence. It's not always easy to say where on what side of the line something falls. So is it a threat to use an expression like, I've got someone in my sights? Is it a threat to associate with someone who endorses violence? Is it a threat to celebrate violence against a person? Is it a threat to claim past violence didn't happen or wasn't really that bad? Is it a threat to call someone a threat? Should we apply a higher standard of what is and isn't violent to people with lots of power or dedicated groups of followers? This is a common enough occurrence that enforcement can seem uneven, but anecdotally, I find that a person being removed from a platform or threatening violence has probably fallen into one of these gray areas at least a couple of times to warrant that, especially public figures. The blue check marks on Twitter come to mind. More obvious threats of violence would usually get you removed a lot faster. Lastly is hate speech. I would say this is the most contentious area. Hate speech is not a legally defined term. The closest defined term, according to the American Bar Association, is fighting words, which are words spoken to an individual without social value that would provoke an otherwise reasonable person. Hate speech can meet the legal definition of fighting words, but it isn't fighting words by default. The American Bar Association also defines hate speech as communication that carries no meaning other than the expression of hatred for some group. The line of what isn't and isn't hate speech is the blurriest of all the lines, including some people who believe that hate speech just doesn't exist at all. But it's still common to see provisions against racial slurs and racial stereotypes. Keep in mind that while hate speech isn't defined within the United States, platforms internationally may have a legal responsibility to police hate speech on their site or for users within those countries. Critics of the platforms argue that hate speech leads to trauma and to real-world violence, and that platforms should do more to remove it from their site, while anti-censorship critics believe users have a right to objectionable speech through the First Amendment, or that too often conservative or right-wing beliefs are labeled hate speech. So then let's consider what censorship means for our expectations of these platforms. Does censorship inherently violate the consumer's trust, and is online censorship unethical? I'll remind you again, our expectations are of the platforms are that they are accessible, safe, and useful. Accessible. Obviously, if you're banned from a platform, that's going to affect your access to it. And if a platform is banning lots of people, that is shorting access to it. But if a user is engaging in behavior to harass others on the platform, or the more extreme case of threatening violence, then that behavior is also making the site less accessible. We are taking away, an arsonist's freedom by locking them away, but we're doing that so that other people have the freedom to live without fear of their home burning down, right? So censorship may be a necessary tool in the effort to make a platform more accessible on the whole, if not for that individual person. Safe. Online safety issues can take many forms, from traumatizing content to harassment to the possibility of online feuds spilling over into the real world. And we accept that free speech in the real world has limits. We discussed this earlier, to protect children from content they're not ready for, to protect the public from panic caused by maliciously falsified information, or to punish real world calls for violence. In my mind, this is the expectation that most clearly translates from the real world, and I believe the same standards should apply. If you can't say something, if your speech is not protected or falls under one of these exceptions in the real world, I think it's totally fine for Twitter to say we don't want that on our site. Useful. Generally, a site with as many users as Twitter isn't going to be made unusable by bad faith posters, but moderators of these smaller sites and forums can a lot of times be overwhelmed by off-topic or intentionally contentious posts. Troublingly, this can be a deliberate attempt by users migrating from platforms cracking down on bad faith behavior. So recently, there was this site in the news called Ravelry. It's a knitting site. It has 8 million users, which is pretty big, but is really, really tiny compared to the users on something like YouTube, right? So Ravelry was in the news for rules banning posts supporting Donald Trump. And in the press release, the site said they have no issues with conservative politics. They were just struggling to keep the conversation on knitting. So however you feel about that action, blacklisting certain content can steer a service closer to its stated goals and make it more useful for that reason. If I'm somebody who's very into knitting, then I want to log into the knitting site to do some stuff about knitting, right? I don't necessarily want to have all these political conversations. Finally, I'm going to touch on the rights of the service providers. We stated earlier that service providers expect profitability and the right to their own ideology. So for profitability, I think that many industries determine a demographic and then pursue it, and we don't have any ethical dilemmas with that, right? So people don't usually think it's an ethical issue when Coca-Cola advertises to, young adults, or that a car manufacturer tries to sell its muscle cars to young men specifically. And you might consider social media platforms to be sort of in the conversation industry. And they have the right to steer their product how they think will be best received by their desired audience. And end users have the right to go to another platform. That's the nature of capitalism. And I don't think, tailoring a product is necessarily an ethical issue. Finally, ideology. I said it earlier, and I will say it again. People want to believe that what they do for a living is a social good, or at least a social neutral. So compelling engineers and product managers and executives of a company to host content that they believe to be harmful, I think that's wrong. We understand that it would be wrong to compel a newspaper to publish information it knows to be false, or force a church to include other religious teachings in its sermons. So why then would we expect Twitter to host users that are ideologically opposed to them? You might disagree, or you might believe that neutrality is a better business model, but removing their ability to decide who gets to use their platform is also a free speech issue. So I hope you guys found this video insightful, or at least informative. I really enjoyed making it, and I'm looking forward to a productive and balanced discussion here in our uncensored class chat room. Thanks, guys.